Hello. Hello. Good morning, YouTube. Today we're going to be checking out some different 3D softwares. As a proprietor of Zbrush in the past and in the present, I'm a big fan of non-polygon modeling workflows, and I decided I want to learn some other non-polygon modeling workflows, especially as a hard surface artist. These CAD softwares are an awesome way to model stuff like it's modeled in the real world. All this stuff in the real world is modeled inside of CAD software, and then they use CNC mills to produce it, especially if it's a machine part. You can tell the softwares are built around the operations that the machine tools can, that the CNC tools can actually do, the chamfers and the fillets. So I figured I would learn one. But then the artist-friendly options out there, there's MOI and Plasticity. And they're both super exciting options for artists to use, both with their own strengths and weaknesses, mostly strengths. And so I figured I'd do a head-to-head, and then at the end of this video, the reason it's running so long is because I did the same thing in Zbrush, and it was kind of proved my point that these softwares do give you some added flexibility, or probably not as much flexibility, but added precision compared to Zbrush. And they make a lot of this stuff super easy, which is nice. So yeah, I spent about 2 weeks inside of Plasticity and 2 weeks inside of MOI learning the software. And then I took this knife that I have, which is called the Reate Exo gravity knife. I have it right in front of me here. And I decided to model it. You can tell based on the shapes and stuff that it's very, it's been designed in CNC, in CAD software and created with a CNC machine. And I figured that having an object in front of me that I could model, rather than doing something from reference on the internet, where I can just put the reference in the background, would simulate some of the concept side workflow that I do most of my work in. Because a lot of my work, if not all of it, a lot of it is more concept work. So there's back and forth, which you'll see in this video. I do quite a bit of back and forth, and trying to understand how these softwares can handle back and forth is important to me. So yeah, Plasticity, speaking of back and forth, is one of the strengths of the software, and you can tell that Nick, who's the designer, put a lot of thought into being able to go backwards and forwards and edit things and change them the way the concept artist might want to change them. You can tell Nick had some interest in the concept side of things. So in this part, you've seen the workflow that I started with. I basically laid down a bunch of curves, because that allowed me to adjust the proportions and try to get all the proportions in order. I then used the extrude tool to generate my first shape, and then using that, some more of the curves I generated on the top piece, which slides out of the way. It's basically like the locking mechanism of the knife. And then I'm just laying down the bevels. This part of the workflow thus far is very similar inside of Plasticity and inside of MOI. So in the next part where I do the MOI, I'll talk about laying down the curves and stuff like that. But again, it's the strengths of these softwares is their ability to lay perfect curves, and you can design things. To be honest, you can spend a lot of time in the design just flat and just setting up the curves and figuring out what relationships make sense, and then start going 3D once you have the shapes and the proportions figured out, and then want to figure out how the integration between other elements work. It's certainly a good tool for keeping your mental RAM or brain power available for the design side of things, because you don't have to spend time worrying about polygons and stuff like that. I took a class from Simon Lee, and he was always talking about his handle is Spider Zero. Check him out on Instagram, Spider Zero. He's a great sculptor. He did some of the kaiju for Pacific Rim, and he was
always talking about using, like, when you have an idea, putting it down so that you can then offload that brain power.
So you don't have to think about that idea anymore.
It's out there in the world, and you can evaluate it and then move on.
And it's a super interesting thing, you know, very easy for us digital artists, but as a sculptor, there's commitment to that because you have to go in and do it again if you don't like it. But there's something to be said for, you know, continuing to work and put things down so that you can figure out what they look like rather than going, ooh, maybe that'll look good, but not actually trying it. But yeah, you know, this software allows for that, and there is some back and forth that you would have to do. So yeah, cut out that circle there. That was probably a newbie CAD scenario where I cut it out using the half circle. I guess it helped me to see it, but I could have just left the full circle there and used that to be a subtractive piece. Figuring out some of the snapping, the scaling, a lot of that stuff's pretty intuitive. But yeah, it's a little bit tricky. It's learning one of these softwares really helped with learning the next, but there are a lot of intricacies, and the differences between them makes it, you know, it's tricky to evaluate. Sometimes I wish all softwares were the same, but I do love learning about workflow and thinking about workflow. And you know, Plasticity is exciting in that regard because you can tell that Nick has thought about the workflow a lot. Speaking of workflow, here I am doing the blade, and this is more of a surface modeling application, a perfect element to test out the software's alternative, their surface tools. Plasticity only added this in version 1.3, I think. We're only on 1.4. Maybe it was 1.2.
3, 2, 1, 1.1, 1.2, 2, 1, 1.
Okay. So yeah, the setup here is to lay out all the curves first, and then set them up in their 3D space so you can set up the connections between them and create 3D curves out of them, because once you have the curves, it's much easier to then loft stuff in between them. I actually tried this once and just deleted it from the video, where because it was one of my first times trying to do this surface modeling in 3D software. But I had set up the shape in 3 dimensions, and when I was trying to like use a subtractive boolean or something, you know, how I was thinking I would do it in ZBrush, although that also didn't work. And it was just really not working. Plasticity has this ability to move faces and adjust the rotation of faces live, but it doesn't work in the way you would expect it to work coming from polygonal modeling, so it's tricky to figure that out. But yeah, I basically went in and did it again using this surfacing setup and taking examples from other surfacing attempts that I've done and other artists that I've seen on YouTube doing mostly surfacing-based workflow. And it seemed like when you're doing surfacing, it's best to lay out the curves and then project, I guess it would be loft your surfaces and then connect them. And this piece here, I actually had trouble getting it to turn into a full solid. That was another thing that I've learned over the course of this beginning modeling, is you got to make sure that pieces are solid. Here I am just doing some bevels. You know, again, this is another one where Plasticity and MOI both work in pretty much the same way. And it's definitely a great workflow for making these types of shapes. It's something that, like, I'm really excited about using CAD software because you can tell there's so many objects. Even this knife, it's like, I know that these were just beveled curves. I know that this shape here was created inside of CAD using the same setup as what I'm doing here. And part of the reason is because it's so easy to recreate. And so, yeah, it's going to lend a lot of believability to the designs. Yeah. This is one that I probably should, down the line, I'll start building a kit of different parts that I have and can just drop in. Because, making a screw. I think when I got to ZBrush, I was just so over making the screw again. And I wanted to show the comparison at the ZBrush video at the end, just for, a benchmark. But it was not. This part of the video is a bit boring. I'll probably leave it in. But if you want to skip ahead, I'm gonna put timestamps in here. This is the majority of the plasticity piece of the video done. Plasticity, I mean, there is a challenge to making this screw and using the array tools and stuff like that. Personally, I'm not a big fan of radial arrays. I mean, I guess for propellers and stuff, I think that using the arrays is going to be super interesting and pretty fun. It's definitely a bit better of a tool than like ZBrush's array mesh, because it's just a bit tricky to use in ZBrush, whereas again, CAD tools are set up to do these types of repetitive array modeling systems. But yeah, just cutting out shapes, making this, what is it? I guess it's a Torx bit.
Torx. It's Torx, twisting. Torx bit.
Yeah, anyways, I skipped ahead a little bit there because it was getting kind of boring. But yeah. Use the radial array tools, use a subtractive piece, double up on the subtract.
You just use a little cutting shell magic, and then you got 3 screws.
I just duplicated the piece off. I would have skipped this part, but it actually shows an interesting piece of plasticity, which is that I don't have to go in and recreate this piece. I can just select all the parts, and I could have done a faster selection job in that and adjust the scale. And that's one of those elements of plasticity that is truly very impressive. And for me as a concept artist, I don't want to be too wishy-washy about things, but it is nice to be able to make adjustments without having to do the whole thing again, which in MOI you would have to probably just undo back to before you had that, unless you did it out of order, which I think I did there, and then just boolean in the shape again, and then subtract it again. So yeah, one of the elements that you can see that I'm playing with at the end here, towards the end here, is the outliner. And Plasticity has an outliner in it right now. MOI, the version I'm using is version 4, but the version 5 beta has an outliner that's just bringing in shapes. As you create them, MOI's always had the outliner, but you had to name stuff one by one. And in the setup I used, I did do a little bit of naming and grouping so that I could do the towards the end, keep things organized. But yeah, that's one selling point that's no longer really a selling point. A lot of the stuff in MOI 5 is actually, it improves the fillets as well. So here's that array tool again. It's definitely one of the better elements that I'm used to having from ZBrush, but it's not as intuitive and straightforward as it is here. And I'm excited to design using this array tool in the future. But yeah, like I was saying, yeah, MOI version 5 has an improved fillet engine and the outliner. There's a few other quality of life things that have happened. And so I think that, if it was MOI 4 versus Plasticity now, with the expectation of Plasticity getting better, it would be Plasticity all the way. Oh, look at this. So good.
So easy to just lay them out and set up the array.
That's a big one from Plasticity and MOI. Both of these tools, compared to ZBrush, that would be annoying to do in ZBrush, but I'll definitely be doing a bunch of repetitive shapes in my designs. If you see repetitive shapes, know that it was just because the software makes it super easy. But yeah, again, really easy to model this knife, and you can see so much of it is set up to work the same way. Or so much of this knife is clearly designed using the tools that I'm using, because all this stuff was so easy to do. So yeah, pretty much wrapping up Plasticity here.
Wrapping it up, and it's been pretty smooth. I'm happy with the design.
It's nice to show it off with the Plasticity matte caps. Although, as a seasoned 3D artist, it's not the main thing I'm looking for in a software, but
yeah, it's pretty cool, pretty cool.
Yeah, showing off the functionality of the blade, that back piece rotates away, allowing the slide to move up and down. But yeah, here's MOI. If you're sticking around for more content, more modeling, I'll actually explain some of this piece now. Again, I started with the same modeling the outlines first, because if I had the actual reference on here, which in both softwares you can bring up the reference and use it to trace over top, I would have just traced all this stuff. But this was one feature in MOI that was a little bit bothersome, was actually figuring out how to move those pieces. I think I just had to reconstruct the lines, and once I did that with like a bridge command or something, it was much easier because the lines didn't have extra points. But yeah, you can see if you were to go back frame by frame, that tilting that piece is not what you would expect out of a polygon modeler, and it was frustrating me for a little while. I was going, oh, this is a horrible software, but eventually I figured out how it actually works, and it's not too bad. But yeah, stuff like that. I mean, even just there, I had to move that lower line to match up with a different point on the pill shape. And doing that adjustment when it's just curves is a lot easier. So laying out your main shapes as curves means that you can dictate the design early and figure out proportions and stuff while things are still more malleable. And so, yeah, again, it's basically the same thing as I did in Plasticity, where I laid out most of the main curves, and especially the ones I needed to figure out the sizes and proportions. And then I started building and cutting. Yeah, it's probably not going to be me blabbing as much in this half of the video, because I've already explained a lot of this stuff and talked about the differences in the softwares. But you'll be able to see the workflow of MOI. A lot of the same stuff. They both can cut lines into other shapes. You cut a line in, you extrude with that line. A lot of times the line will actually cut into two separate parts, which again is another advantage of the CAD softwares, where if I'm splitting up parts in ZBrush, if I want to create two separate parts, it's going to be real tricky. And so a lot of times you'll just drop a panel line or something using DAM standard, or you make indications of these lines, whereas inside of a CAD software, you're actually splitting pieces in half, and if you want to show the line, you can bevel it or use a material difference. And so CAD software does lend itself towards thinking about the functionality a bit more than a lot of times in ZBrush. It's just about the flow of your shapes. So what I'm doing here is I have to... MOI doesn't sometimes accept bevels or indents if the lines are completely overlapping, and so that edge was matching on the shape twice, so I had to extrude it off a little bit to use this subtractive piece. The way that I set this whole build up in MOI here was slightly different than Plasticity. I think it's probably was a bit more intuitive and a better way to do it in Plasticity, but in Plasticity I just cut the line for that top piece of the shape into the surface, and then used that surface to create the actual piece, and then continued building the piece. Here I created the piece using the lines that I drew at the beginning, and so I had to do that subtractive boolean. And yeah, there's often times that these softwares have trouble with things just because of the way that they're calculating stuff, like this bevel. And in this one I was trying to figure out how to adjust the bevel. Once I put the bevel down, I saw that the shapes were getting a bit cramped in the back. There's a bit more space between that rear hinge, that the circular piece of that hinge, and the bottom of the knife, and the bevel is actually a bit bigger than I ended up landing on. But because of the way that MOI works, I was having trouble actually extending that piece down. I think in Plasticity it would be much easier to grab all those bottom faces and just move them down. Here in MOI, it was not. I think I just cut that piece of the video. But yeah. So I just ended up landing on a smaller bevel, and a lot of the times I'm fine with that. It's not usually, my design doesn't come down to the size of the bevels. It's more about, throw a bevel here and there to catch light. But the design is about the bigger shapes and the flow of things, and then I'll stick detail in an area, but it doesn't matter if the software is dictating it be one way or another. It's not usually a huge deal, especially when I'm in the creativity side of things. So yeah, that top shape again was pretty easy. Setting up that top shape in ZBrush. I'm probably just going to be quiet for ZBrush and leave it there for posterity and so if you want, you can see my workflow in ZBrush. But to be honest, it was kind of a disaster trying to do this knife. So many of these shapes were so much easier inside of CAD software. I could have done it better using, if you care to stick around till the end, the ZBrush piece. You'll see I did it pretty much purely with Dynamesh and using the cut lines and stuff. And I definitely think it would have been better to just use a polygonal workflow and a polygonal live boolean workflow. A lot of Blender artists will be familiar with that because a lot of the hard surface plugins are all about using booleans, and I think they have some that are set up to live boolean. But just getting perfectly smooth shapes with the polygonal work, with the Dynamesh workflow at certain angles and stuff can be really tricky. So yeah, here's this same piece, the blade piece, which was the surface modeling test, and this is where MOI really knocked it out of the park. It was super easy to connect all these lines up, sort of similar to how I did in Plasticity, and to some extent I had to do it twice in Plasticity, but here I'm just using the network tool. I'm starting with the loft. I'm attempting to do a loft, but did I just use a loft? I think I just went with network. Oh no, yeah, I just dropped an extra line in there, which allowed me to do a network, and that was all of these tools are going to have problems that come up, but having something powerful like the network where you can just use a series of lines and define your shape more easily, it did feel like there was a lot of control over these bevels, or I think that's called the bevel of the blade. And so yeah, I think if I'm doing surface modeling, I'll probably pull out MOI 3D and, designing cars or something where I have to have a bunch of these smooth surfaces. MOI is going to be, for now, the better tool. I'm very excited to see where Plasticity goes in terms of the surface modeling. I think once there's live updating, it will be, I expect that that's coming because, there's so much other live updating inside of Plasticity. And once that's a thing, I think a lot of the tools will be a lot easier to use. The network tool here is awesome, but you can kind of get a similar result using Loft. There's just, I think Loft, it's very much about how much experience do you have with it. And a lot of the Plasticity stuff, it's like I've tried it a bunch and it throws errors at you when you're using it, but figuring out how to solve those errors and why they're coming up is one of the tricks of 3D modeling across the board. Every software, it's like everything's gonna throw errors at you, and if you can just identify why they're happening and then fix them or figure out a workaround, it's usually the best way to do it. So yeah, just setting up the blade here, cutting in the hinge. This hinge is the piece that the back piece would pivot off of. And this is a crazy knife because it's pretty cool to have been able to model basically every working piece of this knife. There's not threads on my screws, but I could do that. And some of the proportions are different, but otherwise, this thing is exactly the same as the production thing. And it took me a couple hours inside of these softwares. It's a pretty powerful tool. Here I go, modeling a screw again. This one's funny because I think it was easy to set up the array, but then getting the cutting pieces to be the way that they wanted to. I set this up in a slightly different way. I kept on cutting out the top of the circle, and then but really I needed to cut out the bottom of the bigger circle. There we go. Figured it all out. I was trying to do it once and then have it happen procedurally, but sometimes that just is too difficult on your mind. And then we'll throw in a bit more
Cutting shell magic to go from 1 screw to 5 screws or whatever.
And here I'm just reusing the screw indent piece and combining it with that larger screw head or cylinder piece at the back. And this one is kind of nice. Again, it's something that in CAD, in Zbrush, would throw a bunch of errors. Sorry, my voice was extra deep, extra smooth. I should probably just do the whole video with that smooth voice. Anyways, yeah, it's the, in ZBrush you would get errors from the faces being on the exact same plane, but here in CAD, because it's doing all the calculations at the end or something, it works, and it's nice. It's very nice. Nice and smooth.
Next up is some of these indents. These are pretty straightforward, just subtractive Boolean stuff, the type of stuff I'm used to from ZBrush, a lot of people will be used to. But again, using the array tools is kind of nice. Although here I didn't use the array tools. But here I'll use the array tools. And, both Plasticity and MOI have pretty intuitive array tools, so it's pretty easy to set those up.
Select the array tools. What do I say?
Yeah, just about done with this knife. Like I said, probably gonna just let the video play out on the ZBrush side of things. Feel free to skip around. I'll put some timestamps in there as well. Yeah, safe to say ZBrush is not the best tool for this task, and if you're gonna use it, you probably want to use modeling, CAD, no, polygonal Z-modeler setup to do it, because and just use like the booleans to subtract out the blade face and stuff. I had such trouble because the blades it's just such shallow shapes, so using H polish and the type of stuff I usually do is not easy. But yeah, usually want to set up some of these color differences early on. It makes it a lot easier to read the model. But here we go, full knife here in MOI. You know, I think that Plasticity has so much promise that I'm very excited about what that's going to bring. MOI 5 is so super powerful, so deciding which software is still kind of, you know, a work in progress for me. I think I'm going to keep learning both of them because they both have, you know, a lot of similarities, and where the overlaps are, I'll probably just make sure that I set up the keybinds inside of MOI to match mine inside of Plasticity, and then we'll keep seeing where Plasticity goes. Alright, here's the ZBrush section. You know, fast because it's familiar, but probably not the best software for the tool. ZBrush does a lot of other things really well though, so definitely check out some of my other videos. I'll bring out some more ZBrush videos if that's what's interesting to you. But I'm just gonna let the
Smooth music play us out. Take care.